top. And as we go, give them some instruction on what to draw, what to write. And then moms and dads, we have our John notebooks. If you're ready to pull those out, we'll give you some notes to take as we go along. If you would like to use that as your Bible as we go, you have a place to write. How many of you have ever faced, ever experienced a trial? Okay, good. We're all on the same page there. How many of you have ever been through what at least you would call a crisis? And they can be big and small, can't they, everyone? Now, some of our crises we cause ourselves. Okay, most of them. Right, and so we try to learn wisdom from Proverbs and not do that so often, but then there are these crises that might come in your life, and you know that you have to face this thing, you have to go through it, and it really is a part of your life in Christ. This mission, this thing you have to do, like if you weren't a Christian, you wouldn't have to do it. You wouldn't have to go through it. You wouldn't have to face it. Maybe you could avoid it. But you're a Christian, this is something that you need to do. In fact, you can almost, if you thought about it, prayed about it, feel called to do it. What we're going to see today and in this series called Certain Death, hang on, we're going to explain that title. What we're going to see in this series is that Jesus faces certain death with certainty. That's my first slide that I wanted to come up and us just make this point. Jesus faced certain death with certainty. Would you guys say that with me? Jesus faced certain death with certainty. You're going to watch, the Gospel of John is unique in this way. You're going to watch Jesus sail into the storm, so to speak. You're going to watch him walk boldly, confidently into the crisis. And in it, he's going to be certain and he's going to be in control. How many of you would say, I'd like about an ounce of that when I go through my crisis? Now, that's good. It's interesting that because every human being faces crises, the Bible's written to us. You might be facing one right now. There's a good idea that you're facing one right now. So what we're going to see in our passage today is you are going to get, this is a grace from the Lord. He's going to give you a Peter trying to handle a crisis and Jesus handling a crisis. And we're going to have that visually in our text so that we can compare and contrast those and learn a couple things from them. All right, but we're going to begin this way. Jesus faced certain death with certainty. And at the end of our time together, we're going to draw a very big and very important point from all this. So if you would turn to John chapter 18, our text is verses 1 through 27, but we're going to read out loud together today. Jason is going to come and read this passage, read part of this passage for us. So if you find John 18, would you please stand with me? And Jason is going to read. Our reading is actually going to be verses 23 to 27. So John 18, beginning in verse 23.
If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow.
Thank you, Jason. All the people said, Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. You guys have been making your way through the Gospel of John. You were there with Jesus in John chapter 13 when he took his apostles into the upper room. And he began to teach them, said, I'm leaving, but I want you to know, in his departure. And now you've seen his high priestly prayer in chapter 17, which we just finished last time. And now we get to chapter 18, and you notice that no longer are all the words in red anymore. You have quite a few words in black now, right? Which means that now we have story again. It's coming back to narrative. Before it was more didactic, more teaching material, but now we come back to story. And in our story, it's introduced this way in chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, when he just finished praying his prayer of John 17, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. That's a little narrative cue that sets up the rest of the story. Tells us that something has changed. The position of our friends has changed geographically. He has prayed, possibly praying as he walked through the city, leaving the upper room. And now he's come to the edge of the city. He's gone out the city gates with his apostles. He starts to go down a little hill, and at the bottom of the hill there is the brook Kidron. And probably this time of year, they probably crossed it without even getting their feet wet. It was the kind of little creek that mostly was just kind of winter runoff. But now they still call it the brook, and they crossed over it. And what was on the other side, everyone? A garden. And what garden was it, everyone? Gethsemane. So if you're trying to picture it, picture a grove. This garden was a grove of olive trees, which you can go visit today. And there are actually some very old olive trees that are there. Very interesting, mangled trees that when I was there, it's been a while now, but when I was there, they told me that there was still a tree there that was over 2,000 years old. In other words, there was a tree there that was there when Christ was praying in the garden. That's how old these trees are. So you got this olive grove, and Jesus and his friends have gone down into it. And Jesus is about to face a crisis. I guess it's a good way to say it. He's about to face a crisis. Does he know it's coming, everyone? He's been talking about it throughout the Gospel of John, but intensely in John 13 and following. He knows this crisis is coming. Takes his apostles, goes down to the garden. Judas is not there. He's left already, right, to do his thing. Verse 2, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. When Jesus and his disciples would travel down to Jerusalem for Passover and other holy days, while they were there, they could leave the city and travel down the road to Lazarus' home and stay with him. But if you had to be in the city day after day, you didn't want to travel that far. Jesus and his disciples would just go down to the olive grove, nice weather, and they spent the night there. Judas knew that. So he knew where Jesus would be staying. Jesus has probably been staying down there off and on throughout his time in Jerusalem recently. So they go down there, and Judas, he knows this place. Jesus had often gone there. Verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops, he's got officers, temple guards with him, and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees came there. John tells us with lanterns, torches, and weapons. It almost describes as if it's kind of a mob coming. But these are officers to arrest Jesus. In verse 4, now in your John notebooks, this is a place to highlight. Verse 4, Jesus therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward. That is not a victim. You know, when I face a crisis, I feel like such a victim. Woe is me. No one understands what it's like to be me in this crisis. Jesus knew this was coming, right? And he knows that this is part of his mission, doesn't he, everyone? And so what we see, we highlight in verse 4, is a Jesus who is bold, a Jesus who is confident. Here's another word, a Jesus who is certain. He knows what he's doing. And not only does he know what he's doing, he's in control. Things aren't just happening to him. He is asserting himself. What was his body language? What just changed his posture here in verse 4? Did you see it? You might have just said it. I couldn't hear. He stepped forward. Right? That's a person who's asserting, not a person passive in the corner. This is Jesus who sees this crowd of people. He could see them coming. He can hear the clatter of their weapons. He could see their torches burning, and he's with his apostles. And some of his thought goes to this: I love these guys. And Jesus steps forward to meet them. He comes out to meet them. And John has written it so that we would get this from the passage. You're going to see more of that to come. He went forward and he said to them, "Who are you looking for? Who are you seeking?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." It's kind of dark, so we still are counting on Judas to point him out. Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. And by the way, he's told us this twice, because you can tell in John's gospel he doesn't like Judas very much. And John's kind of like, by the way, did I tell you Judas was there? And the idea is it's being read to the church. The church hears Judas' name and goes, yeah, right. He says, Jude, by the way, Judas was there, he betrayed him, and he also stood with them. And in verse 6, now when he had said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Isn't that great? You ever heard that before? You ever seen that before? I don't know, not all of our Jesus movies portray this, but Jesus steps forward. He says, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. I am he." And when he said that, all of them shuddered and hit the ground. Why? What was going on? We have a couple of clues. Most of the time in the New Testament, where you read this phrase, "I am he," you're reading the Greek phrase, ego eimi. I am he. And you supply the word he. That's why he in your Bibles is in italics. Your translators are telling you that's not in the technical Greek, but it's implied. So whenever, let's just say you find the Apostle Paul writing one of his epistles, "I am he," what that means is, that's me. Right? That's me. Ego eimi. But John has made a point in his gospel to do something different with that phrase. And we've seen it as we've gone through our study of the Gospel of John. That Jesus didn't just say, "Well, I am he," and leave it that way. Jesus was speaking Aramaic. So it sounded a whole lot more like he was saying the covenant name of the Lord, which is, in English, I am. So, when he does it in the Gospel of John, John is letting us see that he's doing it on purpose to tell us who he is. And it shows us also why the Pharisees and other religious leaders are getting so angry at him. When he says, "I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. Before Abraham was, I am." And that's probably the strongest one. And they were ready to kill him at that point because they knew what he was doing. This doesn't come through the same way in all the other Gospels, but John wanted us to make sure that we got this. So when we get to this point, and these officers are coming forward, and all Jesus said is, "That's me." Or is that all Jesus said? So I thought, for dramatic effect, we'd try this. Jerry and I were working on this together. Let me see if I can do this correctly. How's that? Jesus and the apostles, imagine, are sitting here together. Maybe they got a campfire going. Jesus hears the soldiers coming. He knew it was coming at some point. Jesus steps up. "Who are you looking for?" "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." "I am." Now, would that explain why they fall backwards? Okay. I'm not saying that's exactly how it happened, but I think that's the power of the moment. I think that's what was at stake, and that's what was going on spiritually. I don't think he had a microphone, but I think it had the same effect because of reverence and because of what it was he was saying. I am. Then he asked them again, who are you looking for? Because they're kind of like they're all on the ground. Oh, that's great, right? Like you could really picture that. I am, and they all fall down. I said, who are you looking for? Once again, that's a question about his identity, isn't it? Verse 7, and they said, well, maybe with a little more humble tone to the great rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth? And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. Verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Everybody, would you say, good shepherd? He doesn't lose his sheep. And he wasn't about to lose them in the Garden of Gethsemane either. So he steps forward and says, let these guys go. I'm the one you're looking for. In other words, officers have come. Help me out, everybody. Officers come to your house at night to arrest you. Do you step forward and start shouting orders at them? Let these go. Okay, sir, we'll let them go. I am. And then they follow along and they do exactly what he says. Notice that Jesus is in charge. Notice that he's confident. Notice that he's certain. Notice that he's bold. Notice that he's in control. Jesus faced a crisis. Now you're supposed to catch this. Ready? Peter faced a crisis. Everybody help me out. When a crisis hits you, we first get all emotional, don't we? What is that question we scramble around trying to answer? We do that one. Well, give me another one. What do I do? And you just start doing things by knee-jerk reaction, don't you? Which sometimes that's right, but a lot of times it's not. Peter has a knee-jerk reaction. Now, Peter is a guy who's given to his knee-jerk reactions, right? And so you're about to see that happen. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Everybody say, poor Malchus. And so Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Which drink the cup means I'm about to take the medicine. The Father has given me something to do. I have to do it. Why wouldn't I do it, Peter? Or Peter, you're thinking wrong. But everybody, I think this, it's been a long time now, Pastor Dan, but I think you might have been the person that taught this, and I remember hearing it. And I've told it to you before, and I think you guys before. I think it's just fun to think about. But a lot of people, we see these movies where Peter pulls this sword out from wherever, and he cuts off Malchus's ear. And we all go, man, I thought he was a fisherman. Turns out he's a musketeer. As if he had this rapier and this perfect skill to go, how you like that? I could have killed you, right? Everybody, was Peter a musketeer? Do you think he was a swordsman? Help me out. What was he trying to do to Malchus? You guys said that kind of angrily. Now, Malchus is a servant. He's a slave, but this is hard for us to understand in our culture. But a slave in ancient times and for a long, long period of time could have been a very powerful person. And Malchus was a powerful person. He was there possibly overseeing the priest's kind of part in all this. And so Malchus all of a sudden loses his ear, but realizes Peter was actually trying to cleave his head. And so, Jesus stops Peter and says, Peter, look, I've got a mission to accomplish. And by the way, that's another verse to highlight. When we got to that point where Jesus said, look, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? There in verse 11, Jesus is once again being, what's that word? Certain. It's no use fighting these soldiers. I know what my mission is, and this is part of my mission. So both Jesus and Peter faced a crisis, but note really quickly, Jesus faced his crisis with certainty. He knew what he was doing. He was in control. He was prepared. Peter, on the other hand, and let's not bash him too badly, Peter's going to become powerful, right? Strong Christian. And we're not going to say mean things to his face in the heavenly country, right? Because we know he's prone to violence. So Peter, on the other hand, reacts to his crisis like a loose cannon. And you guys know that metaphor, but for the kids that don't, ancient sailing vessels, they had to tie those cannons down. And why not just nail them to the floor? Because you had to move the cannon around and you had to reload the cannon. It required movement. So what you'd have to do is you'd move it and then tie it back down. And if you did not tie it back down, what would happen to the cannon? the recoil of the cannon could push it backwards, or the ship tossing in a storm could all of a sudden find the cannon. I don't know how much a cannon weighs. A lot of weight. All of a sudden, rolling back and forth, breaking legs and maiming people and punching holes in the side of the ship. Everybody say, oh, loose cannon. And isn't that a good description of me, of you, when we react to a crisis like everything's out of control, we start hurting everyone around us? Loose cannon. Both Jesus and Peter faced a crisis. And I want to give you these three things. They're just a little extra. Why was Jesus able to face his crisis with such certainty? I want to give you these three things quick, and I promise to come back to them. Jesus was able to face his crisis with certainty because he was certain that this was his Father's mission for him. Like he knew this is part of what I have to do. I know the cross and the lashings, but even the arrest is part of the mission. And secondly, Jesus was certain that he was going to complete this mission. He knew there's nothing for it. And most of us suffer with doubt in the middle of crisis. Will I make it? I don't know if I'll make it through. I don't know if I'll hold on to the end, if I'll have my integrity at the end of this, if I'll hold on to faith. But we need another believer at that point, maybe our spouse, to say, I know you. You will make it through this crisis, holding on to your faith. That's the kind you are. Right? Jesus was certain that he was going to complete his mission. And lastly, Jesus was certain that it would be worth it in the end, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. So those three things, I think there's probably a lot more reasons, but those three things make Jesus certain as he faces arrest. When I get arrested, all the times I get arrested, that last time, if I ever get arrested, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be flooded with doubt. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be my best self. Pretty sure I'm not going to be the greatest saint there is. I'm just going to be trying to make it through. Jesus was able to face it with certainty. Both Jesus and Peter faced a crisis. Now, what's about to happen, beginning of verse 12, I'll move more quickly now, is you have the narrative continues to be intertwined. And I think this is an interesting feature of John's account of this. You have these two things happening at the same time. You have Peter's denial on the one hand, and you have Jesus facing condemnation by the high priest on the other hand. And they're both going to occur at the same time so that the tension rises with these two events happening. Peter's going to be outside the house denying Christ, and inside the house, Jesus is going to be boldly, certainly, confidently, he's going to be the one asking the questions. He's going to be in control till they get to the point where they don't know what to do with them. And then the story will conclude Jesus' account with the high priest, but then dramatically with Peter's account of his denial. So hang on with me now. Peter's about to go into now his denial. The detachment of troops in verse 12, the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. You can imagine what it's like as an apostle seeing your master tied up like a criminal and being led away. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, we've pretty much all agreed by now that this other disciple, this unnamed disciple, this disciple that Jesus loves, was most likely John, who's writing the story, who was there, who knows all the details, like which ear Malchus got cut off, right? What was his name? John knows those details. So what you're going to see happen now is John tells us details that nobody else caught, except Peter would have got the outside. He was responsible for those details, but John goes inside. So they go to the house of this guy named Annas, and Annas used to be the high priest, everybody. But the Romans came in and decided they didn't like Annas, and so they illegitimately deposed him. So if you're a Jew and you watch the Romans depose one of your high priests, you probably still think quite a bit about that high priest, don't you? And so anyway, whether that's true or not, Annas was a powerful man in Jerusalem because of that fact. In fact, he had several family members that were all priests. And the current high priest is Caiaphas, who is his son-in-law. So Caiaphas and Annas had this plan, and Annas must have asked Caiaphas, let me have him first. Let me take him first. And so Annas brings Jesus to his house. And it was still appropriate, the gospel writers do this, it was still appropriate to call Annas a high priest. In fact, it's appropriate to call a few people high priests, even though Caiaphas is the high priest that year. Okay, so that's why that's going on. Takes Jesus into the house, and there's a courtyard around the house at the time. And so at first, Peter stops outside the courtyard, but John goes in because John knows people. And that's an interesting note about John too, right? John knows some people, so he gets to go in. He realizes, I lost Peter. Peter's outside still. So John goes over and tells the girl at the door, hey, this guy's with me, let him in. Peter comes into the courtyard area, still outside the room where Jesus is being held. Right, everyone? But now he's technically in the house. So he's in the courtyard area, and he's outside, and they've got some fires going, and he's warming himself there, but anyway, the servant girl that John had told to let Peter in, that servant girl in verse 17, said to Peter, wait, you're not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And now catch this phrase. He said, "Uk ego eimi." Not I am. Now, I'm not saying Peter meant that to happen that way, but I think John meant us to read it that way. So if you're circling the I am statements, contrast the I am statements of Jesus. He was confident, certain, he knew who he was. Contrast those with Peter's statement, I am not. He would not even own up to knowing being a disciple of Christ. Verse 18, now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there. Thank you, John, for telling us what kind of fire it was. Once again, an eyewitness detail. For it was cold and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So Peter is there now, and he is in denial. He's trying to just survive the night, but also figure out what happens to Jesus. But then note Jesus now, he is being condemned by the high priest. This is not a trial. This is at a trial, a Jewish trial, they would call witnesses, right? Joe, what did you see? Randy, what did you see? And if those two agree that they saw the same thing that I did, it doesn't matter what I say. I'm guilty, right? A Jewish trial. But this isn't that kind of trial. That would have been a fair trial. That probably wouldn't have happened sneakily at night. Instead of having witnesses, this is this kind of trial. And maybe your spouse has given you this kind of trial before. It's not why did you leave that? It's not were you the one that left the mess in the floor in the bedroom? It's why did you leave the mess on the floor in the bedroom? We call that poisoning the well. That's a double question, right? That's what they do to Jesus. They're not trying to find out facts. They're trying to get him to accuse himself. And that was illegal. Jewish trials, that was illegal. So Jesus faces Annas, these high priests. He knows it's all unfair. And Jesus, the high priest, then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And so Jesus comes back with an answer. It's pretty sharp in verse 20. I spoke openly to the world. Where have you guys been? I've been in Jerusalem teaching in the temple. I've been teaching in synagogues. I've been teaching in every public place. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Don't you dare accuse me of being one of those false teachers that brings people into secret rooms and tells them secret things. Everything I've said openly and publicly. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. In other words, Jesus is calling for what? Witnesses. And how many of you think that without ratting them out, he's looking around the room and seeing some of them right now? Nicodemus might be there, right? Joseph Arimathea might be there. We learned in the gospel account in John itself that there were others who had given their lives to Christ, who believed in the Christ. Let me say that. Who believed in the Christ, but had not said anything because they were afraid of the Pharisees, and Jesus knows they're standing in the room, bring out witnesses. In other words, give me a fair trial. In verse 22, and when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Believe you would be like that. And that's when Jesus says, if I've spoken any evil, bear witness of the evil. Bring witnesses. In other words, give me a fair trial. But if I've spoken right, then why do you strike me? Jesus faces this condemnation with certainty. Peter faces his little crisis with denial. And we're meant, since these stories are intertwined, we're meant to contrast those two things. But now let's come to the conclusion. The conclusion of Jesus' part of the story is verse 24. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. In other words, Caiaphas, son-in-law, let's see what you can do with him. And here's the climactic conclusion of Peter's story in verse 25. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you're not also one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the one who got his ear chopped off by Peter, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied again. Help me out, everybody. And for the most powerful, dramatic effect possibly in the entire Bible, at just that time, the rooster crows. Which is significant because Jesus predicted it in chapter 13, verses 36 and following. But more important because of this reason. It was the same day. In other words, what does that mean? Peter said, oh, Jesus, I'll never leave you. I would die for you. And it's almost as if Jesus could say, you won't make it 24 hours. The rooster crows. Sometimes he crowed right in the middle of the night. But few of us knew that because we're sound asleep. The watchman knew that. But often the rooster was crowing at the sun coming up, at dawn, which still means the same thing. Either way, it was a brand new day. Peter had all of that had happened in one day. He made it maybe a couple hours. Like, wow. Do you think Peter, he probably hated roosters from then on. I love eating roosters, which who doesn't, right? I don't know. But here's the main point. Here's this point. Both Jesus and Peter faced a crisis. But while Peter was in denial, Jesus was certain. Bring that slide up for me. Both Jesus and Peter faced a crisis, but while Peter was in denial, Jesus was certain. Now, we won't be too harsh on Peter again, but at the same time, let's examine again, why was it that Jesus was so certain? And let's look at these three things one more time. Jesus was so certain because this was his Father's mission for him. He knew that getting arrested and being put on trial and condemned by the high priest was part of his mission. He was certain of that. And secondly, Jesus was certain that he was going to complete this mission. I'm going to go through with it. I'm going to push through. And thirdly, maybe most importantly, Jesus was certain that it would be well worth it in the end. So somebody says, well, I want to, first of all, be inspired by Christ. I'm so thankful that he did finish his Father's mission. I'm so thankful, and it is worth it in the end. And I've given my life to him, and the joy that was set before him. He's all tons of people coming into the kingdom. I'm so thankful for that. But I kind of like to face a crisis in my life the same way, because there are these crises that come up that wouldn't have come up if you weren't a Christian. But now you're a Christian, you've got to go through it. You say, how am I supposed to deal with this? I've got to deal with it like a Christian. So this is my crisis. So how could I do that? And I give these three things that maybe could help us make the transition from Christ's life to our own life. I could face a crisis with certainty when I'm certain that I have a mission. And here's the mission: to glorify Christ with my life. I've got to get through this crisis, And I can't just get through it like everybody else. I can't hide out from it. I can't lay out from it. I can't blame it on someone else. I've got to get through this crisis, and I need to get through it like Christ would have me get through it to glorify him. And that's what I'm going to do, so I'm certain of that. So this crisis must be part of that. So I can be certain about the storm that's raging. Secondly, I'm certain that I can complete this mission by, and I'm going to say it this way, by walking in the Spirit. Or you could say it this way, by the grace of God. Or by the hand of the Good Shepherd. In fact, the ultimate goal, of course, would be to die in the midst of such crises. Isn't it, everyone? I mean, one day that's how we'll go. We will die in the midst of whatever it is that's killing you will be your crisis. That will be your final crisis to go through and to come out as a conqueror, as an overcomer. We have to do it saying, I am going to press through this, walking in the Spirit, by the grace of God, holding the hand of the Good Shepherd. And then lastly, I'm certain that it will be worth it in the end when I wash up on that other shore. And all those crises get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think those things help us, but I want to get to now what I think is the biggest, most important point of this message. We watch Jesus face certain death with certainty, but don't you wish you could face your trials with that kind of certainty? Don't you wish you could face financial trouble with certainty? Some of you are facing physical crises right now. Don't you wish you could face it with certainty? People problems, marriage problems, financial problems, job problems, and they seem so crushing and so important. And you wish that I wish I could do that. And maybe we could learn a few things from Christ's example, but this probably is more important. Because one day death will be our crisis. And then we'll reflect back on this passage and go, you know, I used this passage to make it through some pretty hard times in my marriage or in my work or that one really hard time I was having. But you know what's more important than that now that I lay at death's door is this one. Jesus faced certain death with certainty so that I can too. I can be certain even in the face of death. Jesus faced certain death with certainty so that I can too. Would you guys say that with me? Jesus faced certain death with certainty so that I can too. I want to invite you to spend some time in prayer now. Because somebody heard the word certain and immediately their mind ran to so many sermons where they thought to themselves at the end, I'm not certain. If death were at my door right now, it would be cold and terrifying, and I have doubt. I'm not certain. And so that's an easy invitation for us to take right now, isn't it, everyone? To be certain in the face of death. That requires a little thinking and some praying, doesn't it? Spend some time with Jesus now to be certain. All over the room, let's not leave this place until we're certain.